Welcome to No Rares Required, episode 36, Selesnya Food. Yesterday I covered the best archetype, Rakdos, or Black-Red, in Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. But today I wanted to talk about how to take advantage of green. Green is largely considered the worst color, and therefore it's open in most drafts. And I have found myself in green maybe more often than I should. Selesnya Food feels like it should be an aggro deck, but several of the common white 2-drops, like Westfold Rider, the 3-1, and Took Reaper, the 2-1, they really struggle with the plethora of 1-1s in the set. My approach is to take advantage of Int's Fury and 4 powered green drops like Mirror Guardian, Enraged Hjorn, and Baggin Porter. So it ends up being more of a mid-range approach rather than aggro, but with limited removal. It is a very creature-heavy approach, so choose your targets wisely. Then you just add whatever theme your other color is doing. Int's Fury is so key to my desire to be in green. I highly recommend it being the signal that you should look for to indicate that green is open. It's kind of odd that I picked Selesnya as the one to showcase for green first, since of all of the green archetypes, I think Int's Fury performs the worst in Selesnya because it is so creature heavy. And but with everybody drafting Rakdos, it hasn't been uncommon to get multiple copies of the green cards that you desire. And I do think there are some really fun synergies in Selesnya Food specifically when it comes together. So let's dive into the cards. My first Tier 1 common is Enraged Hjorn. There aren't a whole lot of Ring Temptation options in green-white, but even a 4/5 level 1 Ring Bearer has been good enough, and creatures that have higher toughness than their power make great Ring Bearers, since they typically need to be blocked by 2 or more creatures, and maybe you've managed to get to level 2 on the Ring Emblem and you can trigger a loot. The other thing I like about it is that it has trample, and you can amass a fair amount of food to make this guy really big off of East Farthing Farmer. My other Tier 1 common is Baggin Porter. A 4/4 for 4 is not terribly exciting, but it pairs nicely with Int's Fury, and between your legendary uncommons and maybe a Ring Bearer or 2, this usually attacks as a 5/5 or 6/6, which can be a lot of mid-range pressure. My last Tier 1 common is Great Hall of the Citadel. I'm not usually a big fan of splashing, but Selesnya splash for legendaries, it fits this archetype quite well. Many Partings, the sorcery for 1 green that lets you search for a basic land and create a food, works quite well and can synergize with Mushroom Watchdogs, the 2/2 for 2 that can sacrifice a food to gain a permanent +1/+1 counter, and then Vigilance for a turn, if you do end up getting a full playset of the many Partings. That in mind, many of the uncommons and rares that are interesting to splash, like Eowyn, Fearless Knight, and Old Man Willow, which has amazing synergies in the Selesnya Food archetype, I'll mention later in this guide, and so if you do aim to splash, keep Great Hall in mind. Now for Tier 2. East Farthing Farmer I've enjoyed even outside of Selesnya Food, but in this archetype you have the most synergies to take advantage of the food token. And playing this later in the game, you can pump for +3/+3 or even more, which works well with Enraged Hjorn to push through some impressive trample damage. One of my most drafted commons of the set, Protector of Gondor, I put it at Tier 2. A 3/3 for 4 that creates a 1/1. I like cards that give me 2 rectangles in 1 card, and it pairs quite nicely with Rosie at uncommon, since her +1/+1 counter triggers off of any token, not just food. My last Tier 2 white common is Errand Rider of Gondor. I think it really shines in Azorius and Boros, where you have more Ring Temptation synergies that make it a draw card instead of a loot, but Selesnya has a couple of 2-cost legendaries, Samwise and Frodo at rare, and Merry and Frodo at uncommon. If you have those cards, then this is an excellent pick. In Fury, I really debated between Tier 1 and Tier 2. I settled on the top of Tier 2. As I mentioned earlier, it's usually the signal that I use that moves me into green, but all of the green archetypes, Selesnya is focused on building tempo through food synergies rather than disrupting your opponent, since you don't have great removal options in the archetype. You still want this card, but I decided on Tier 2 since I think the archetype can function with minimum removal. Generous Int, I also put it Tier 2. I wanted to take a moment and echo something that I heard on Sam Black's podcast, Drafting Archetypes, which, by the way, if you don't already watch Sam, you're missing out on some of the best Magic knowledge in the community. Land cyclers are not fixing. If you were going to do the 4-color, 5-color, legendary, play everything deck, keep that in mind. That being said, including 1 or 2 over a land in your main color gives you some interesting flexibility. 5 and 6 drops in your opening hand are almost as detrimental as a mulligan. Almost. So being able to treat them as tap lands early and then 6 drops later is handy, but you still don't want that many 6 drops in your deck. In this archetype, I like to include 1 and still play 17 lands, since I aim to have Pathfinder to take advantage of hitting 7+ mana. Speaking of which, Woe's Pathfinder, I also put it Tier 2, my preferred method of splashing. 2-cost mana rampers that are also fixing are great in Limited, and I like to run 17 lands with the Land Cycler since there are several 4-drops that I really want to play on turn 4, and since there is limited Ring Temptation in Selesnya, it can lead to floods. But Pathfinder's ability to give +3/+3 and trample has been very relevant, even when you aren't planning on splashing. My last Tier 2 common is Mirror Guardian. I only want this with Int's Fury, thus the dilemma of what tier to put Int's Fury into, because being able to remove your opponent's single blocker and hit for 6 on turn 4 is pretty decent indeed. At Tier 3, we have Hobbit Sting. I think every deck should have a minimum of 4 interaction. 23, 4 interaction and 19 creatures is pretty crazy. Maybe 5 interaction. Just remember that fact when you are playing and be very selective with what you want to remove. If you're going to draw only half of your deck, that means you get to remove 2 things, so make them count. I also put Mini Partings at Tier 3. I'm not really looking to include it unless I need fixing for a bomb, but it is worth mentioning that DeFore, another amazing Limited streamer, came up with a way to make green work pretty early on in the set that is centered around his card. And if you have a full playset or even more, then it's worth picking up some Mushroom Watchdogs to go with it. Now for the uncommons. Selesnya gets 1 mythic level uncommon, and that's Frodo Baggins, Destroyer of 1/1s. I think this uncommon opens up some very interesting options, and why I mentioned Great Hall in this guide specifically. Base Selesnya, splash all of the legendary cards that are passed to you is a strategy that has proven to be successful. The 1/3 works well to block your opponent's ring bearers, it helps you get some much needed ring temptation, and you can manipulate its stat block through Rosie or Int's Fury or Pippin's Bravery or Pathfinder's +3/+3 to snipe your opponent's blockers. Even without gratuitous amounts of legendaries, this card has performed quite well and is an easy pack 1 pick 1. At Tier 1 we have Rosie Cotton of Southlane. The dream is Rosie into Build the Pony, but Protectors of Gondor is pretty good too, since she triggers off of any token. The longer she remains on the board, the more power you will get off of her, especially in this archetype. She's done some terrible things in Historic with Scurry Oak loops. If you're into that sort of thing, no judgment. At Tier 2, we have Eowyn, Lady of Rohan. I think Selesnya is her best archetype. You have a couple of cards, specifically Mary at Uncommon, that are better the more that they can attack and not die, and First Strike helps get that done. And then giving a ring bearer like Frodo or Enraged Hjorn Vigilance helps keep the pressure up without lowering your defenses. Eowyn is also great at slowing down early pressure until you can overpower your opponent with food synergies. My favorite card of the set, Bill the Pony. I put him at Tier 2. One of the best ring bearers in the game, turn 4 Bill, turn 5 Enraged Hjorn, and just start hitting for 4 damage a turn. You have plenty of other food synergies to keep Bill running strong, and if you played Rosie on turn 3, you also get to give a creature a permanent +2/+2. Not too shabby. Meriadoc Brandybuck, who looks a little ominous in this picture. Like, I'm not sure I want to have any of that tea. An important thing to note is that whenever one or more halflings attack, I got absolutely rolled by an opponent who played Mary on turn 2, then the blue-red Bilbo on turn 3. They must have made 10 food. You can do similar devastating things if you can get Frodo in play on turn 2 and then follow it up with Mary on turn 3. Quick Beam Upstart Int, I put it tier 2. You are playing a creature-centric strategy, or at least I recommend that you do, which means you should have at least 2 creatures to hit with the +2/+2. Baggin Porter on turn 4, Enraged Hjorn on turn 5, and then Quick Beam on turn 6. Easy. And my last uncommon worth a mention is Old Man Willow. Of all of the legendaries to splash at uncommon, I think Old Man Willow is the best one. With all of your food, you have ample tokens to feed to Old Man Willow, and I like to have plenty of lands in the archetype, so Old Man Willow can get big pretty quickly. And now for the rares. The top performing rare is Faramir, Prince of Ithilien. This is the sort of legendary that makes me go, yep, it's time to splash. Well, at least in theory. I still have yet to open one. But I have played against it many times, and this thing is busted. If they attack you, you get 3/1/1s. If they don't attack you, you get a card. Oh, and the effect is an emblem, so it's still there even if they remove it. A mistake I've seen several people make. If you can, figure out how to play this card. It's insane, and Selesnya is set up for it to be pretty easy to splash. Horn of Gondor will always get the honorable mention. It's amazing. Samwise Gamgee is a rare more specific to the archetype, a 2/2 that whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield, you create a food token. Personally, I think Samwise should have also made a food when he enters play, but I guess he does like to feed his friends. I think Frodo, Sauron's Bane, is best in Boros, where the lifelink comes in handy during the race. I've still yet to see the game-winning blow off of a level 4 ring emblem, but you know it's happened somewhere. It's a bit too hard to get the 3 black sources to make it work in this archetype, but a welcome hobbit in Selesnya. War of the Last Alliance I also think performs better in Boros, mostly because of finding our Lord and Savior Éomer of the Rittermark, but Selesnya has some good legendaries, especially if you end up doing the Splash the Legendary strategy, and attacking on turn 6 with an Enraged Hjorn with Double Strike is a fun time. Boromir, Warden of the Tower, I also put it tier 3. The dream is to play Boromir, followed by Prince of Ithilien. Now they have to use 2 pieces of removal for Prince. Good luck. And for that reason, I think Boromir is best in Azorius, but being able to give your whole board indestructible is definitely a welcome addition in a very creature-heavy strategy that should end up having a big board. Delighted Halfling, I put it tier 3, best in Golgari, which is the archetype that cares the most about ramping into big tree folk. But similar to Pathfinder, it helps you get to your tasty 4-drops and is a splash source if you are doing the legendary deck. And the last rare worth a mention is a Selesnya Superstar, File of Galadriel. If you can get your hand empty, then every loot draws you 2 cards. But popping food tokens for 6 health is really what makes it shine the most in this archetype. And it taps for mana of any color, so it's also helpful for being a source if you do end up splashing. And now for the mythics. Arwen, Mortal Queen, is the top-performing mythic for the Selesnya archetype, and one of the top-performing mythics in the set. I managed to beat someone who copied Arwen off of a Storm of Saruman, but it was a slog, I think 18, 19 turns, something like that, and best game of Magic I've played in the set, hands down. Arwen is a 2/2 indestructible that you can pay 1 to remove the indestructible counter and give it to another creature for a turn. It gives both Arwen and the creature a permanent +1/+1 and permanent lifelink. And it's just wonderful flavor too. I mean, like, they really did a plus job on this card. It's just too good. And last but not least is Radagast, the brown. I've managed to open this mythic 3 times in 40 drafts, and every time that I say I'm done with green, Radagast comes back to tempt me back into green. Even though hobbits are a thing in Selesnya, they aren't the only thing. Between humans, treefolk, dwarves, halflings, the occasional spider or horse, you have plenty of things to hit with Radagast. Radagast was my pack 1 pick 1 in day 1 of the Arena Open, and will always hold a special place in my heart. He's my favorite dirty hippie wizard. I hope this helps shed some light on how to make green work. Next week, I've got my eyes on Izzet spells, but if there is a different archetype that you would like to see, let me know in the comments below. Remember to click like and subscribe, and check me out on Twitch if you want to come draft with us every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. In-pod drafting is a real treat and feels very different from Arena. My community is very welcome to new players, and I love to share thoughts on the game that I've enjoyed for over 25 years. So good luck in your future games, get those trophies, and I'll see you all next week.